Hello, Black Swamp Podcast listeners. Thanks for tuning into our latest episode, number 38, with Ivan Trevino. If you've been listening regularly, thank you, and hopefully you've enjoyed dropping in on these conversations. If you're new to our series, also thank you for joining us, and feel free to travel back in time through our episodes. We've had a lot of great conversations with BSP artists, educators, and friends over the last few years. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts. Then throw us some stars, the more the better, as this helps spread the word about our little podcast to more percussion enthusiasts like yourself. Before we get to our latest episode with Ivan, I want to say a few quick words about Dynamics Drums. If you're not familiar, Dynamics Drums is our line of drum set style snare drums. We use the same hardware, raw materials, attention to detail, and manufacturing prowess as our orchestral snare drums, but with a few key differences, like our exclusive snappy snares, unique inlay in the unibody shells we make in-house, and custom auxiliary ballad snares for softer musical settings. Visit our website, linked in the show notes, to view more details and videos for our Dynamics drums, where you can contact us to pre-order drums directly. We also have our snare units and some available stock drums on our Reverb store, so check that out as well. So, if you're unfamiliar with Ivan Trevino's compositions and work with The Big Trouble, it's definitely worth a Google. A diverse collection of musical genres, instrumentation, orchestration, and performance opportunities help make his projects accessible to both listen to and perform, with an ongoing thread of social awareness, inclusion, and equity. Ivan hasn't been on our Artist Endorser roster long, but he's definitely one of those people that makes you feel immediately comfortable, as if you've known each other really for years. Before moving on to our conversation, I did want to mention one of Ivan's latest projects, Co-Write. This is a book for composing music and exploring creativity. We touched on these topics during the episode, but I feel like I didn't give this publication enough time at the end of our conversation. So Co-Write includes 15 musical ideas meant for musicians to explore, grow, and make their own. The book also includes audio tracks of each musical idea recorded by Ivan, along with a musical guide to help people as they create. Co-Write is intended for any musician with an interest in creating music, from student to professional. We'll have a link to his Co-Write publication in the show notes, which you can check out after listening to Ivan now.
Good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
And to hear you.
Yeah, it's exciting. Well, I only had like 10 or 15 minutes, so we've used up that time troubleshooting. so we got to go. Yeah, it's great to see you. I know we've met via PASIC before, I think, in the past. So it's great to see and talk to you again. You have a lot going on, my friend. A whole kind of collection of percussion and like rock oriented projects, and then obviously composing, blog writing. You're a music ambassador. I'm not sure what that entails, but maybe we can uncover that a little bit. Sure. And then obviously you're active in other kind of social awareness and sort of equity and representation stuff. So that's all basically things I wanted to try to touch on a little bit while we're talking. Hopefully you're doing more of the talking than I am ultimately. But I always kind of like to get a little bit of backstory from guests. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes and sort of give me the early Trevino years.
I don't mind at all. Well, I had a really interesting musical upbringing because my dad was a musician and songwriter, but not trained. He sort of learned how to play on his own, and he played it in bands, but those bands played by ear.
Sure.
So that's sort of the musical world that I grew up in, and I started playing drums in his it was like a Tejano gospel country western band in South Texas. When I was like really little, like 2 years old, and it was sort of church related. So we would play a lot of church events. We would travel all around Texas and play like music festivals.
Sure.
And I remember like packing my dad's big red van with gear, and then we had a big trailer, and it seemed like we were doing that a lot. And I just thought that was normal, you know. I thought that's what people did. And as I grew up, you know, I started to realize that my upbringing was a little bit unusual and special in certain ways. And so I think, you know, even till today, like as I grew up playing non-classical music, and I remember starting like punk bands in high school and writing music, and sort of that being sort of an angst outlet for me.
Sure.
And having all of these sort of non-academic experiences, and as they sort of combined themselves and met themselves with my classical training, I think that's sort of how, you know, I was able to maybe develop my particular sort of voice as a composer and as a performer. And it's really always informed how I view music too. But to go back, like, I was playing in my dad's band for a long time, mainly drum set. And
sorry, to one immediate question already, like what does playing drum set as a 2-year-old in a Tejano band kind of look like?
it looks like me standing up
Right.
and not having a drum thrown, because there weren't any that were small enough for me to sit on. And I played on like not little baby kits, you know.
Yeah, sure.
So my dad bought me actually like a electric drum set, a D drum electric drum set, when I was pretty young. And yeah, that's what that looked like. And my dad isn't a drummer, but he taught me what he knew. And my half sister Deborah plays drums, so she taught me a bit. And essentially, like all of my family were all musicians, so we would travel together. So yeah, it was awesome. I loved playing. I remember one of the vivid memories I have is like right before I would go up to play, I would always be sitting next to my mom in the audience, who would travel with me. And she would like nudge me and say like, okay, discipline, like, because I always wanted to play more than I should have, you know. And that was a lesson that she instilled in me that I still think about a lot, even when I'm composing music. Like, how can I simplify this to make the musical idea come through in a very clear way? So anyway, that's sort of what it looked like. And the second thing that is very vivid to me, and it doesn't really have a lot to do with making music, but my dad would always give me the microphone, and he would say, I want you to introduce the songs. I want you to get used to, you know, talking to people in public and in person. And that's something that has always stuck with me too. And something that I try, like, you know, when I was teaching at Baylor University, and still, you know, when I work with students via clinics and stuff, that's a thing that I always try to impart on them. It's like, it's really important to not only communicate the music, but to communicate with words what we're trying to do as musicians, to have a personal connection, you know? So anyway, there was a lot sort of rolled into my experience, but it wasn't anything that was forced on me. Like, I loved playing music, and it's what I wanted to do. And as I got older, I remember in junior high school, it was time to like choose an instrument, and I was going to do percussion, but like I saw what was happening, and there was like no drum set and it was like way different. So I decided to pick up saxophone, and that's actually how I started to learn how to read music. And I played saxophone all the way through my sophomore year in high school. And I was like planning on majoring in saxophone because I liked it. It was fun. And then my junior year of high school, my high school in Texas hired a percussion teacher named Philip Makula. Philip was an Eastman alum. I didn't know what Eastman was or anything. Like, I just knew he went to some school that was far away. And he started a percussion ensemble, which my school didn't have. And one thing led to another. And, you know, like a month later, I quit saxophone, and I was on my way to doing percussion all the time. And eventually, like, I followed in his footsteps, and I went to Eastman. And while I was there, I studied with John Beck, and I started writing a little bit of music I miss songwriting. I was doing a lot
Right.
of that in high school. I wasn't a composition major. I just something that I like to do, and yeah. And then there's many parts of the story. Like I met some cellists that play in a band called Break of Reality that asked me to play drums. That was in 2003. So we're still a band today, 18 years later, and
Yeah.
we traveled and tour, and we still do that now. Obviously, like we've taken a bit of a hiatus.
Right.
So Break of Reality is going great. We moved to New York City after I graduate Eastman. We are playing in Central Park and in the subways, and playing real gigs too. And like we're making ends meet. We sold like something like 40,000 albums in the subways and in Central Park in a year, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And then we had some member changes. Michael Burritt got the job at Eastman, who I had known for a long time through some summer seminars that I attended, and I studied with him. And then I graduated with my master's in 2010, and I started writing music again. That's when I wrote my second piece, Into the Air, which is a marimba duo. And I started doing a ton of stuff, man. Like I was doing School of Rock teaching songwriting, teaching percussion, drum set, making sandwiches before that for a little bit, until things started sort of getting going. And eventually, like, composing started to snowball a little bit because of YouTube and all sorts of stuff. And people started asking me to commission me to write them music, and eventually it got to a place where I didn't have to do a lot of that type of teaching that I didn't, I don't think my heart was really into as much, although I was happy to do it. And I started to focus just on writing, and fast forward till today, that's what I do. Like my job is come to my studio and depending on what projects are due, work on those things. And when there aren't projects due, sometimes it's just getting to create and sit here and try to make some music that maybe people would want to play. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's sort of how I ended up here.
No, you pretty much touched on 100% of what I want to sort of dig into now, like sort of unpack some of that.
Yeah.
Definitely creativity is up there after, I mean, this morning while I was working and, making some notes for this conversation, I started listening to Break a Reality first, and then The Big Trouble with Andrew Worden. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this stuff is creative, and it's like kind of fusing all these different elements, obviously, that you're interested in, sort of more rock oriented type things, but classical music and contemporary percussion. So maybe let's start there. So it sounds like the Break of Reality was kind of one of those first projects, and you already mentioned that you kind of touched base with cellists at Eastman, and then that began to develop, and you're still in contact now. Does that mean you will travel to New York and perform with them, or they'll kind of come your way, or how does that work sort of logistically?
That's a great question. Well, it's gotten to a point now where we have people scattered around the country. We sort of have a roster of people, and we get together for performances, all across the states and abroad as well. And that's how it works now. I think when we were younger, we all lived in similar proximity in New York City. And as the band started to develop and sort of get better performance opportunities, and also develop our own projects, we decided that we could live wherever we want. And it's probably better that way, because when we get together and we see each other, we're like happy to be there. And we haven't been traveling all the time, which can sometimes get a little stressful, although really fun. We talked a little bit about this earlier in your intro, or you mentioned it, but Break of Reality became ambassadors for the U.S. State Department during the Obama years, musical ambassadors.
Yeah.
So essentially, we would travel, and we've traveled to probably 12 or 13 different countries abroad, and sort of use music as a way to build a connection with people in other countries, and also to develop relationships and to collaborate with musicians in these countries too, who are playing instruments that we might have never even seen before, you know.
Sure.
So it's just sort of a music as a pathway to develop, you know, good relationships with other countries, and
Right.
that's incredible too. And that's been a big part of the Breaking Reality story, I think, is doing
Yeah.
that sort of work with the State
So,
Department.
yeah, how does that even transpire? Does somebody at the State Department like see you playing, or you're just sort of already active and it happens organically like a lot of things, or do you reach out to them?
Oh, that's a great question. So they actually have
Oh,
a
thanks.
pro.
Two in a row. That's awesome. I'm off to a good start. Usually
No, it
my
is. The State Department has a program called American Music Abroad, which is a program that anybody can audition for. And a lot of bands, a lot of ensembles will audition to participate in this program. And then they select just a handful to have for a particular calendar year's roster.
Hmm.
And we were selected at the you know, our first year, I think, was 2014, if that sounds right. And they've sort of invited us back over the years,
Okay.
which has been really amazing. We started out in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and now we've been to Mongolia, South Korea, Philippines, Japan, like
Yeah.
Haiti, a ton of Brazil also. Yeah, a ton of places through this program. And it's been great. Like, it's been some of the most memorable experiences that I've had.
For
It's just nice
sure.
to play music for, like, especially like we went to Turkmenistan, which essentially is like the second most closed off country in the world next to North Korea.
Hmm.
So when we played there, like, people don't really meet many American
Hmm.
musicians ever. So for them, it was like, you know, they were extremely grateful to have any sort of musical sort of opportunity, which is, yeah. So that's been an awesome part of our story as a band.
Yeah, for sure. To be able to travel like to all those different countries, like where you wouldn't get to otherwise, and then play music, like part of that experience, I'm sure is amazing. Who, so who kind of sets all that up? Obviously, somebody at the State Department or kind of organizes that. Are there, are there counterparts of yours sort of in the other countries that you visit, and that's all sort of set up?
That's exactly right. So like, there's consulates and embassies in these other countries that coordinate with people at the State Department within the American Music Abroad program.
Hmm.
Some of those people in that program travel with us too, so they're sort of a quasi tour manager. Um, so yeah, that's how it works. So they're in connection with representatives at the embassy, who then coordinate our travel, our gear, our
Right.
sound checks. Like, it's a very well run program.
Sure.
And every situation is different. Like, some
Yeah.
situations are incredibly well run, and others, they're not used to hosting as many concerts. So
Right. It
um,
does. That's my initial thought, is sometimes it could be a logistical nightmare, especially if you're, I mean, maybe you're working largely with musicians or people that are familiar with performance, like, and not just like coordinating and traveling. So, if you have to try to explain the intricacies of whatever piece you're playing or what your instrumentation or your needs are, maybe there's sort of a loss of communication, or get that gets lost in translation
oh my
sometimes.
gosh, totally. Sound checks on these tours are typically like twice as long as they should be.
Yeah, sure.
But so you're definitely right about that.
Yeah,
And also, like, since we're taking so many flights, I play a lot of drum set in the band, and I'm not
sure.
traveling with my drum set.
Yeah.
So depending on where we are, the drum set situation could be great, or
Yeah.
it could, like, I need to spend an hour tuning it. So
Right.
it all depends.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess transitioning a little bit to Big Trouble, which is not the same, but sort of somewhat similar, I guess, is in the sense that it's there's kind of this rock element, but then there's contemporary or like classical sort of percussion element, and there's vocal. So there's sort of this multi-genre, multi-instrumental aspect. Like, can you tell me how that developed with Drew? And then I guess ultimately, I mean, whenever I hear music like that, I just think, how did it come together? Like creatively, like not necessarily who had this idea and that idea, but like how do you collaborate? Like how do you kind of come up with these ideas and uh, sort of go back and forth and rehearse them, or come up with concept and ideas and
Yeah.
stuff? Like the sort of creative aspect of it is very interesting to me.
Well, Drew first, who's a really good friend of mine, also a Phoenix Suns fan, so he's really having a moment right now. Um, he reached out to me about a project that we ended up sort of sitting down for. We had a beer at PASIC, and he said, "Hey, I have this idea for like this big percussion band. I think it'd be really fun, and I'd love to collaborate. I feel like he said our musical interests are similar in terms
Mhm.
of sort of non-classical sounds and genres, and I remember talking, and we decided like we want to have a singer, and which sort of like with Break of Reality, I love playing in that band, but I really miss having a vocalist. So that was one of the things that we wanted to include with Big Trouble. So after our beer at PASIC, Drew applied for a grant in Boston through the Boston Foundation, sort of pitching this idea for
Mhm.
this big percussion band that included some music video components and some recording components and some live performance components as well. And the grant was accepted, which was really great. And that sort of enabled us to take some first steps. Now, creatively, to get to your point, essentially what we did was we rented a bunch of gear in Boston and we put it in this big arts garage that we also rented. And we set everything up and we had like no preconceived musical ideas.
Mhm.
I remember getting everything set up and sound checking stuff, and I was at the electric keyboard. I played some chords, and he was like, "That sounds great." And
Okay.
and I was like, "Well, like it was a chord progression, I think, just 3 or 4 chords or something." Um, and he, we started just talking and saying like, "What could this, what could this idea, what does it need?" And we started thinking a lot about contrasts, like contrasting ideas in terms of color and sound. So like we had these dark keyboard chords happening, and he went to the glockenspiel, turned his mallets over, and started like playing rhythmic rattan stuff, and it sounded really beautiful and sort of shimmery. And we had like the foundation for what we thought could be the seed of a piece, and that turned into our song called Red, White, Blue, Orange. And it sort of just happened that way. There were drums set up, so I went to the drum set. He was playing the chords, and it sort of
Yeah.
just grew that way. We didn't have a plan, and I don't know if that's a good or bad thing,
Right.
but it worked for us. And
Sure.
I feel like when we get in a room together, Drew and I, we can work quickly. And I think because we share like this similar musical vocabulary,
Mhm.
things tend to happen in a quick sort of way, and we don't have to think too much. One of the things I always think about is like classical musicians sometimes overthink things. It's almost I don't know. It happens a lot in terms of even how we program music. Like we play one recital a year or
Right.
something. Like, and everything is focused on this one thing. All of our chips are in that sort of basket, so to speak. But
Yeah.
I think with Drew and I, like we sort of just let's just see what happens, and we're not gonna take everything we do as like the end all ultimate thing. We're just gonna
Right.
continue to create, and that's been a great process for us. And he's just a joy to collaborate with.
Yeah, that's interesting. The sort of chips in one basket idea. Like we have that same conversation at work sometimes. Nathan runs our social media, and then we collaborate a lot on like marketing stuff and um video content and whatever's going on. And he and I will, it's like I think you're right. Sort of the musicianship in us, like wants everything to be really precise and kind of perfect right
Hmm.
away, or when we put it out. And we do definitely have to tell ourselves, okay, we just need to um, shoot. There was a term that you used earlier. We basically need to take a pause or take a breath and be
Hmm.
like, it's okay. We can keep doing more. We can keep growing. It can keep getting better. We don't have to hold ourselves to like this, like the highest standard, like right away, immediately. Like this is going to transform. Uh, so yeah,
I think that's exactly right, and I think we hold ourselves to that standard
right,
because that is sort of embedded within the genre
yeah.
that we live in.
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
And in our sense, I mean, product wise, like, yeah, we don't want to come out with something that's sort of subpar right off the bat. So there's definitely amount of like attention to detail and high quality, like with our products.
hmm.
But we're not marketing geniuses. We didn't go to
Right.
we're not like, we didn't go to business school and marketing school and stuff, so we're learning a lot of this on the fly. I've been working for Black Swamp for 21 years full time now, so it's all kind of like learning as you go. And same thing with Nathan and Jamel, who we bounce a lot of ideas off of. And also, like, we're just sort of learning as we go. So if we make it better every time, then that's sort of how we grow.
Yeah, and sometimes even with writing music or performing music, I love watching sports like basketball. I watched a soccer game last night, USA Mexico, and sometimes like having those moments where you don't quite make the right decision
Hmm,
can sometimes be helpful in the long run.
sure.
So yeah, there's a lot at play there, I think. But I think in terms of and that this attitude has really helped me too. Like I want to care for every phrase that I write. I want to care for every note that I write. But at the same time, I don't want to compose in a way that does not allow for some freedom within the performance of that work,
Mm-hmm.
like if I go on YouTube or if people are sending me videos of pieces of mine that they've recorded and everyone is exactly the same in terms of the dynamic and phrasing,
Right.
like I think that would make me sad. So like sometimes when I'm writing music, I won't always put in every single sort of phrase or dynamic marking or every articulation, and it's not for it's not to be
Because you're
lazy.
lazy.
Yeah,
Right.
it's because
Right.
I want people to explore and take some time with those things, because that's part of the music making that's so fun, is if you're playing chamber music, having those talks and saying, what should we do here, what do you think about this, let's try this. I enjoy that aspect, and I think other composers are very, they want everything exactly detailed in certain ways. So I think it's just a taste thing, but that sort of works for me.
Yeah. So a couple questions with the Big Trouble. Do you notate stuff, or is it, because it sounds largely improvisational, is that how it's somewhat left? Like maybe you
Oh.
have some sort of pillars of, ideas, and then you go from there, or is ultimately like these pieces notated?
Yeah, a lot of them are notated. Although I will say, like, for some of the pieces that are sort of drum set oriented, and also like pieces that have multiple drums happening,
Mhm.
there is room for that sort of thing. Like if I'm playing drum set, I'm definitely not playing the same thing every performance. And I don't even think my drum set part is notated per se.
Sure.
And that's good. I wouldn't want to do that. I think I would want some room to be creative within the structure of the song.
Right.
Um, so yeah, they are notated, and that's just for like I remember playing at PASIC when we were playing with the brand new band of people, like
Right.
friends of ours, but we had never performed together until then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so having it notated was very helpful.
Yeah.
We could send them the parts and they could learn it, and we got our one rehearsal the day before, and
Yeah.
luckily, we chose people that could make it happen and
Yeah.
sound really good.
So, and that kind of leads me to my next thought about this is, um, I mean, you're available for like residencies or like sort of seminars or at schools or universities with the Big Trouble. Is that correct?
Hmm. Yeah.
So how does like so how does that work, I guess? So you can go into school and collaborate with like totally new people. Um, and that kind of ties back to your basic performance. Like these were all like people maybe you hadn't performed with before, but you're, putting it together the day before, the morning before, whatever.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Like for these residencies, essentially the way it works is me and Drew and Madeline, our vocalist, Madeline
Right.
McQueen, we're sort of like, that's the band. And then we have a lot of parts and a lot of things that need to get played outside of our parts that we we'll call on whoever we're playing with. Like if we're doing a residency at Tennessee Tech University, which we did last year before the pandemic, essentially the percussion studio becomes our band, part of our
Right.
band.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
that's sort of the goal of those residencies is not for us to play and for the students to watch, but for us to collaborate and for those students to be part of the Big Trouble for that event.
Mm-hmm.
And even more so than that, for them to help market and promote and learn a little bit about that side of things as well. So they
Mm-hmm.
really become part of the group in a number of different ways. But that's how it works. And we send
Yeah.
music beforehand so they can sort of get familiar. And more importantly, we send the audio tracks so they can hear the music, what it sounds like. But those experiences have been great. Those residencies have been wonderful. And honestly, like one of the coolest things is seeing Madeline, our vocalist, who does not come from the percussion world,
Right.
sort of she has found herself
Yeah.
playing with marimbas and vibes and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. Cool.
Which is pretty cool too, I think.
Yeah. Coexist with it.
Hmm.
So where did the name come from? The Big Trouble. Like every time I hear it, I want to think like the Big Trouble in Little China, like but I'm sure it's outside of that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think that if I'm not mistaken, we were sort of spitballing a few different options.
Yeah.
And there's a coffee company called Counterculture that has a coffee called Big Trouble, and I feel like that had something to do with this. And since we envisioned sort of a large ensemble, a big ensemble, that made sense. And since we were also playing music that clearly doesn't fit the typical percussion ensemble thing, I felt like trouble was a nice word for that.
Yeah. You're gonna get in some trouble. Man.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
And I did actually at PASIC. We played on some vibes that Mallet Tech had loaned us, and one of the pieces has like the opposite ends of triangle beaters.
Oh,
yeah, and it sounds beautiful, but it might have left a mark. But everything's fine.
you smoothed everything over.
Yeah.
So before we kind of transition to like your composition life, I did want to, I threw out improvisation kind of briefly, and maybe it sounds like maybe how some of these pieces with the Big Trouble start to take shape or form. And then you also, I was scrolling through my Facebook feed the other day, and there's Ivan Trevino playing like a snare drum improvisation. And the copy was like, I don't really know what to play, so I'm just going to improvise right now. Is that like a couple things? Is that sort of part of your regimen, I guess, either daily or whatever, regularly? And I hate to ask if you have a philosophy on improvisation, but does that sort of work its way regularly into your either composition or performance or whatever?
Yeah, that video was when I first got my snare drum from Black Swamp, which sounds
that's
wonderful.
So nice. Yeah, great.
And I wanted to play something to show people that I got a new drum, and because I thought it sounded great and it sounds wonderful. And I started playing like De La Clue stuff and other stuff, and it just like I don't know. I said, I think I'm just going to do something different. So I started to improvise just a little bit. And that's what came out. And honestly, in the back of my head, like I'm writing these sort of short etudes for a program at Juilliard. And so snare drum stuff has been in the back of my head already.
Right.
and I knew like I want to do stuff with rem and snare. Like I like that combination of sounds. So like this improvisation that I did was not just to show people like I got this new drum, but it's also a creative outlet for me to start exploring compositional ideas that I'm going to use later.
Sure.
And I think I'm definitely going to use some of that stuff. So yeah, like if I'm composing music for a particular project or thing, I will very much spend time just exploring sounds and creating sounds on that stuff. And at the same time, I might also completely step away from those instruments. Like I do a lot of singing into my voice memo, and those ideas turn into pieces too. If the pieces, well, even snare drum pieces, I'll just drum sing or something.
Right.
So yeah, I guess like creativity and improvisation for me go hand in hand with the music that I write.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said you sing because, and again, I was scrolling through my feed, and there's Ivan Trevino, and there's a post that says if you can sing it, you can play it, and you're singing through. I mean, it sounded like De La Cluse, or maybe it was something else, and maybe it was in the post, and that's something. I mean, I'm not involved in drumline or sort of the marching arts anymore, but when I was, that was something I would tell students, like drumline students, like if you can sing this, you can play it. Like it's almost like, I mean, it's obviously not visualization because you're verbalizing it, but to me, it's kind of the same concept. Like if you can imagine yourself shooting free throws and sort of sinking every shot or whatever, or you can think through the music, or you can sing through it. That gives you sort of a better chance of playing it.
Yeah,
Like
that's
go ahead.
exactly right. I think the same way too. I often tell students that are maybe having some trouble executing particular passages or whatever the case is, like to step away, like let's go take a walk, let's walk in time and just see if we can sort of audiate this thing. Because I sort of feel like once we start adding implements and different techniques and all of this stuff that we have to do with our hands, like that's only going to make what we're doing harder.
Right.
And if we're having a hard time taking it to the basic level of just making sure that we understand the rhythms that we're trying to execute, then it gets even tougher when we start playing four mallets or we start doing a bunch of different rudiments on the snare drum, et cetera, et cetera. That's been a whole thing of mine for a long time. And I think it honestly came from when I was really young with my dad, and how his, because he writes a lot of songs too. And when he's teaching those songs to his bandmates, like they're just sort of exploring ideas and they're singing, and he says, oh, try this, bup, 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 bup. And that sort of makes sense for me. And that has stuck with me, I think, even today.
Yeah. Now I'm remembering a thought that I tried to express earlier, is you mentioned not overthinking it. And I think that sort of ties in a little bit, like, okay, you got to separate yourself. And that's what I was trying to say earlier. Nathan and I have to tell ourselves all the time, like, okay, don't overthink this. Like, and let's sort of step back and figure out really what we want to do and not over kind of complicate it. So I guess transitioning to composition then, I mean, you were kind of talking about improvising and starting to think through some textures, maybe some themes, some exercises or some sort of improvisational exercises. So it sounds like that's how a lot of your compositions sort of take shape or begin to form.
Yeah, that's correct. It's very much like, it's very similar to, in my head, to how I used to songwrite when I would play guitar and sort of start to mumble, melodies or lyrics that didn't make sense, but just sort of creating that way. And it's very similar now. Like if I'm writing a marimba piece, there's usually some sort of seed or motive that exists throughout the piece, or that the piece is sort of based on, which is very similar to a songwriter, having a seed and growing it into a song. I think it's a songwriting thing, honestly.
Sure.
And that's just, again, because of the background that I had, that's comfortable for me. Like, creating in that way makes sense. Singing, it makes sense to me too. A lot of my marimba pieces, like I'll sing a line and then I'll go to the marimba and figure out how to adapt it for the instrument. But I think hopefully when people leave a concert and maybe one of my pieces is on it, hopefully they're not singing all of the 16th notes. They're like singing the musical line.
Right, sure.
And I think that's because that's how a lot of those pieces were conceived,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a big part of it. And then from there, in my brain, I have like this idea box that I sort of visit, and there's all these different terms, and I've written some of this stuff down. But like if I ever get stuck, there's these words that I'll sort of think about, like contrasts. Like, how do I use contrast to get out of here? How can I use range? How can I, what's the form? Am I exploring form enough? Like, there's like, hundreds of words that are sort of in this little idea box that just help me, move on with the piece, or sort of get past certain points in a piece.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like there's little seeds that on my voice memo that no one will ever hear. They're just really bad,
Maybe one day you just release like a voice memo compilation of like sort of Ivan Trevino seeds. That sounds weird.
I found some old ones from like when I wrote Catching Shadows, like back in 2013.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like some of these ideas won't turn into anything, but that's part of the process too. And that's the thing that I'm starting to learn, is I'm not putting all my chips into every single seed, right?
Right.
Like if it can't grow, then I'm just going to let it be and maybe visit it later, but I'm not going to let it hold me back. And I feel like when I was younger, I'd come up with like a riff or something, and I would do everything I could to make that something. And looking back on it now is like, and I think this is true for everyone. Like, I think we have more than just one or two seeds in us. Like, we have a lot of things that we can grow, and we don't necessarily have to put pressure on ourselves to make something great out of every little thing that we, put out or whatever.
Right. So moving back in time a little bit, like how did your composition interest, I guess, take shape? Like, when did that sort of, I mean, I guess I know the answer. You were doing it sort of with your family since you were a young child, but more, I guess, professionally, or more in the sort of the orchestral percussion or like modern kind of percussion realm?
Yeah. Well, I think I gravitated towards musicians, percussionists who were writing their own music and playing their own music.
Sure.
Like Gordon Stout was a big influence. I played a ton of his music when I was younger. Michael Burritt too. I played a lot of his music, and it just made sense to me. Like, why would I just play covers? Like, I want to play music that I create. Sure. And there were examples of that already, via Gordon, John Beck, my teacher, who wrote a lot of music for percussion and timpani, Michael, and so many others. There was sort of a path that was starting to get created that I was able to just sort of hop on and follow. But yeah, those people in particular were big influences in terms of the sort of classical percussion side of things.
Yeah. So speaking of influences, this is something I usually ask kind of closer to the end of a podcast, but since you brought it up, like what else, either musically or non-musically, you sort of pull influence from, I guess, and either for your composition or for your performance, like basically what kind of influences you?
Yeah, that's a tough question because every piece is different.
Right.
Some pieces are very much influenced by particular people or social events.
Hmm.
Others are just influenced by that moment of creating, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, in terms of musical influences, like when I was younger, I listened to a lot of like indie rock music, pop music, a lot of Mexican music, like mariachi music. Um, so yeah, I feel like all of those things exist in my vocabulary,
Yeah.
and that sort of is just represented of the work that I create and how it sounds.
Right.
So yeah, it's hard to say. Like, you know, oftentimes today, I don't listen to a ton of music, and I think I'm okay with that. Like,
Yeah.
I'm
So
surrounded by it a lot.
you're not a big Harry Styles fan then?
No, although
Okay.
I like Harry Styles, I
Yeah.
like the way he dresses.
Yeah.
I think that I don't listen to as much anymore.
Yeah.
I think I'm so like, there's so much music around me, and like it swims in my head a lot.
Yeah.
That when I have a moment to like have space, I think I just want to take that. I think that's okay, you know,
Yeah.
personally. And I know some other composers that are the same way too. And plus, me and my wife have two children now,
Yeah.
and that's sort of like the focus for us now, you
Yeah.
know. So there's less time to like. I'm gonna dive into this obscure record.
Right.
I don't
Right.
have that. I don't have that time anymore.
Well, I just mentioned Harry Styles because or Shawn Mendes is, I think that's another sort of younger
Yeah.
contemporary like pop star. My I have two girls, one's 9 and 13. People, the couple people that listen to this podcast are probably tired of hearing about them because I think I mentioned my girls pretty frequently. But yeah, they're like Harry Styles fans or Shawn Mendes fans. So we listen to that in the car, and I'm like, okay, this is actually really cool and well crafted and
Yeah.
like melodic and interesting. And there's also like more contemporary music that's inspired by 80s or
Mm-hmm.
that kind of vibe and style or sort of synth pop related. And so I do try to play this game sometimes. I think they've caught on. They're smarter than I give them credit for. But I'll be flipping around stations, and one of them is sort of a 70s, 80s, 90s and now station,
Uh
and I'll play something from that, and I'll ask them, okay, is this a new song or an old song? Is this can and they're like, Dad, this is old, we can tell. I'm like,
Right.
oh, okay, well, it sounds, I don't know, it sounds to me like it could be current, but
Yeah, some of the new stuff does have a vintage sort of vibe to it.
right.
And speaking on Shawn Mendes, who's like an amazing vocalist, by the way.
Sure.
One of the members of my band, his name is Patrick Laird, in Break of Reality. He's performed with Shawn before. He played at like the MTV VMAs with
Oh
Shawn
yeah,
and
cool.
all sorts of stuff. And he
Can you
says
get
like,
my can
oh,
you
what's
get my
that?
nine can you get my 9-year-old an autograph?
I can try. I can
No,
try.
no, it's all right.
Anyway, Sean's great. He's an
Yeah,
amazing vocalist, actually.
yeah,
And I guess I just said I don't listen to a lot of music, but
yeah.
obviously I listen to
Right.
enough to know about Sean.
I will, and this is more for my dad. If he also listens to my podcast sometimes, or the Black Swamp podcast, and he gave me a hard time because I referred to a turntable as a record player, and he's kind of an audiophile. He was a speaker engineer, like a loudspeaker engineer for a long time. That was his
Oh, cool.
career, and I do collect albums and have a turntable, and I refer to it as a record player. And I was talking the other day, he was like, "Oh, Tim, like it's not a record player, it's a turntable." And I'm like, "Oh, sorry, Dan."
That's one part of our thing that I want to learn more about.
Sure.
It is audio recording stuff
Sure.
because it makes such a big difference. Obviously, like my room here, I recently moved into a new studio, and it's not treated at all, you know.
Sure.
So it's super live, and like I'm starting to look into things because I do a lot of recording, and
Yeah.
I want to make sure that it sounds good, you know. So maybe I
Yeah.
don't know if your dad's into that part of the audiophile stuff,
No,
but
not yes and no. I mean, it was largely car audio
oh, cool,
loudspeakers. He worked for a company called Rockford Fosgate or Carbonell back in the day, or I'm trying to think of some of the other companies he worked for. I'm drawing a blank right now. But then he did get involved in more like studio like monitors and like smaller speakers or things like that. So
cool.
yeah, he's definitely was into. I mean, when I first kind of started working at Black Swamp, he's like, "Well, did you ever?" And we've recorded obviously sound samples and things, and for our drums and tambourines, and try to get as much as we can. And he's like asking me about like spectral analysis or like I don't know if that's actually a thing. I don't know. I just made that up, but like waveform analysis and all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, wow, Dad. Like, no, I haven't thought that deep about it, but you like being able to kind of compare different shell types and sizes and things and look at waveforms and use
Right.
that as sort of marketing material and ideas, which we do in a sense, but we try to make it a little glossier, like all
Sure.
these sort of buzzwords and
No,
things for
totally.
yeah
It makes such a big difference, though.
yeah
Like even when I'm composing, like after I get through singing or whatever the seeds are, like if I feel like a little seed is worth exploring, I'll throw it into Logic
sure
and I'll explore from there. But like even there, like I want to make sure the sound libraries I'm using are like are good quality enough
sure
to make me feel like the sounds being produced are going to replicate what it might sound like, you know.
hmm
It makes a huge difference
yeah.
for me personally.
And I mean, we do a lot of audio and video recording, especially the last couple years, and like, and that's kind of our point is to have the best quality representation of our instruments. And fortunately, I mean, Jamel, who's our VP of operations here, he's also has a lot of experience with recording and that kind of tech and stuff. And Nathan, who I mentioned previously, has experience with audio and recording. I know enough to be dangerous. I can use GarageBand right now. Obviously, I had problems using Zoom earlier. I'm not sure what happened there, but so yeah, we're kind of set up that way. We do all of our own audio video stuff in house. So we try to make the best representation of our product because we know our gear is expensive, and especially we know a lot of college students and even high school students are purchasing our product, or band directors or college departments and stuff. So we want to have the best possible representation for our product online, like visually what it looks like, and video and stills, and then also what it sounds like. And we'll throw some reverb on stuff here or there, or tweak some things, but really Mel sometimes doesn't touch much at all because
Hmm.
we're got high quality mics and high def video stuff, and trying to produce the best quality audio video that we can. So
Nice. And high quality instruments.
yeah. I mean yeah, you're right. I mean, it is, when we talk about this stuff at work, it is kind of like all part of our concept. Like we want to have the best possible instrumentation and then the best possible representation of
Hmm.
that. So um let's see, I'm just scrolling through my notes here trying to see what else we want to talk about. Sort of, you're also writing. I know you have a blog and you've had several articles within the last couple of years and recently, um, about something that I think is really kind of a thread through a lot of your projects and the work that you're doing, and that is definitely diversity, equity, representation. Um, did that kind of develop over time? Is it something even from younger years that you were aware of and tried to communicate, or how did that
Yeah,
develop?
well, I think it has developed over the years.
Yeah,
Like I've always been aware that in classical music settings, there probably aren't a lot of other people in the room that look like me, you know?
sure.
Um, And I think as like this new civil rights movement has been happening, I think it's put a focus for a lot of us minority musicians to just realize how things are structured and built. And for me personally, it's given me more clarity to know that it's okay to speak out. It's okay to talk about representation. It's okay to sort of what's the right word, like advocate for a more diverse looking classical music world. I feel like that's so important because as I think back to my younger years, and even in college at Eastman, and even now to a certain extent, like there weren't a lot of people that I could look up to who looked like me, that I could say, wow, like they're doing what I want to do, you know. I don't remember a ton of instances where that happened, and I think that can be really meaningful for people, especially young people, especially people like me. Like I grew up in a really low income sort of situation in a small town where not a lot of people leave to go do anything. So to see people excelling that might represent you in some way is important, you know. And I've heard like my friend Josh Jones talk a little bit about this too. You know, there's many things that minority musicians have to think about that not everyone does. You know, like for example, Josh mentioned this online the other day, like, you know, if he's walking to go practice and he's holding instruments, you know, he has to deal with the situation where somebody might say, hey, is that your stuff? You know,
Right. Does that belong to you?
Right. Does that belong to you? Or do you have your ID? Can I see it? Like, and that happens more than people think, you know,
Right.
and that can be very stressful, and that can cause some trauma too, you know, like and Josh mentions this, and I think about this a lot too. Like ultimately we as musicians just want to do music. That's
Right.
what we want to focus on. If I'm going to go practice somewhere, the last thing that I want to have to deal with is to exhaust energy on that type of situation, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Yeah, it's
so
definitely an unnecessary level of additional stress that
yes,
involved in it.
that's exactly right. And there's layers to this too, like, you know, in terms of like the faculty at typical classical conservatories definitely doesn't look like me or Josh typically.
Right.
The audience typically doesn't either, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's this big move now to be more inclusive, and honestly, like the way that I approach my songwriting and my music making has never been geared towards that typical classical music audience
Right.
anyway. Um, and I'm hoping, you know, as people are opening up, you know, sort of realizing how important it is to diversify what their institutions are doing, like it's also kind of necessary, because the typical like classical, like white classical 55 and older audience, it's like they won't be around like forever. Like
Sure.
we need a new audience. And I think you know, embracing um, diversity, embracing a variety of different styles and genres is going to be like crucial
Right.
to keep our field sustainable.
Right. I mean, one of sort of the main I try to come up with titles for podcasts sometimes, like what's the kind of the main message here, and I wrote down even before we started speaking is diversity in music and message, like, and I guess that's I was hoping I didn't misspeak when I said, you were in, your composition life or your collaborations or your projects, that there's this thread of sort of awareness or representation, but I feel like there is maybe unintentionally, even because of the diversity in genres and your past experience, and as a Mexican American player, percussionist and
Hmm.
musician, and sort of that is bleeding into your music, sort of natural diversity, I guess.
No,
um
yes, that is definitely correct. It always has.
right.
And I just never viewed it through the lens of race or diversity. And
Yeah.
as I've gotten older, I've realized like, the music that I write is in part because of my upbringing
Right.
and the music that I played. And I think just the civil rights movement that we're in now has led me to be more vocal and to advocate for equity
Right.
in a very clear way, to have difficult conversations
Yeah.
with people and loved ones. And it's not an easy thing to do. And
Yeah.
and honestly, it's not like necessarily I don't know, like there, I think it can be stressful as a person of color to take it upon themselves to
Yeah,
like
sure.
fix stuff too. But I think there's a balance with me personally. Like sometimes we do have to have those conversations, and I've been happy and able to advocate for those things because they mean a lot to me.
Yeah.
And I think people really, especially people of color, I feel like they're just sort of tired of status quo stuff and they're ready for change. And sometimes, that means speaking out. And, in my recent blog post, I think I got a lot of support from it, but I think other people may have felt like, I don't know if an all white roster is always bad, but I kind of feel like we have to try, we have to push people. Like I don't
Yeah.
think it's 2021. Like we can't be there
Right.
anymore.
Yeah. No, we have these conversations at work, honestly, like, it is 2021. Like, it's things need to change and to be different. And part of our conversation is whose responsibility is it? I've had those conversations with Jamel regularly, who's African American and our VP of operations at work. And he's like, I think there are some people of color that believe that it's not my responsibility at all. Like,
Right.
white, middle-aged white guys like me have a pretty good gig going. So it's sort of our responsibility to figure it out. But, is that demographic going to? Not necessarily. So Jamel's like, I think, like you're saying, needs to be a voice and advocate. And then also part of our conversation is, what is my responsibility? What is a Black Swamp's responsibility? And I'll have these conversations with my wife too. She's a graphic designer. So what's her role, even in her occupation, kind of her sphere of influence in the design choices that she's making? Just like,
Mm-hmm.
what are my decisions? What decisions am I making at work that are going to help kind of propel this conversation or move things forward and push for equality and representation and things that are legitimately important to our team. And so yeah, those are conversations we have all the
That
time.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And honestly, that's part of the reason why I gravitated towards Black Swamp to begin with.
Yeah.
It's because you're not. Um, some people just view running a business as that, with
Sure.
no
Sure.
sort of social responsibility.
Yeah.
But I love that about Black Swamp, and I feel like you guys are a great example for other companies to follow in terms
Yeah.
of those social issues, which I think are so important. And it goes even beyond like, like I wrote a piece recently for guitar,
Mm-hmm.
where the players share a guitar and they use like little sticks to play on it. And I decided to notate that piece in tablature. And for me, tab is like an accessible way to learn guitar music.
Yeah.
And I think some people might shy away from writing in tab because it's not as maybe formal as traditional notation. But that's just one example of trying to make the music that I do more accessible to people, and
Yeah.
access and affordability and equity. Like all that, like they all share characteristics,
Sure.
and that's like one of the focuses that I've had a lot recently, is just like the affordability of things and trying to make things accessible to people, because that can ultimately, I think, help make things more equitable too.
Yeah, and that was sort of one of my final questions, like moving forward, like what intentional steps, I guess, were you planning to take in your composition or collaborations and projects that you're doing? And that obviously sounds like one of them, like making things, making your music more accessible, like even just how people read it, and that means, different people can play it that may
Yeah,
not read standard notation, whatever.
that's exactly right. And I think also, like encouraging people to be creative in their own music making. That's a big thing for me.
Hmm.
It doesn't make me sad, but it makes me like, I want to see more young musicians when they're learning percussion to have some sort of experience creating music too, like to have those things work hand in hand, because I feel like they inform each other. And I feel like there's many percussionists that have a lot of good music and creativity in them, in terms of maybe writing music or improvising music, that they might not be exploring. Sure. And that's a big thing for me, is to just encourage creativity. I think that can really be helpful, especially to young musicians as they grow up, as they're looking for their own voice. I think writing music can be a big part of that. And I've been advocating for that for a long time, but like, I released this project called Co-Write over the pandemic, which is essentially like a lot of little musical seeds that I've created that I want people to explore and grow and make their own. And that sort of falls in line with that thinking, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you got amazing things going on, Ivan.
Thanks,
And
man. I appreciate it.
yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing it all with me. And I know we're just kind of more recently, like, officially working together, but I totally look forward to like whatever collaborations or projects we can work on together in the future. I already have some ideas going.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Like,
awesome.
just seeing like sort of the improv stuff that you're doing on social media, and I know you already have some other kind of educational things in the works that I'm looking forward to possibly collaborating on. So, but thanks for the last hour plus and the conversation.
My pleasure, Tim. Thank you so much for everything. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having amazing instruments, and thanks for the convo.
This has been a BSP production, recorded and produced out of the Black Swamp Percussion Facilities in Zeeland, Michigan. Audio production assistance by Nathan Coles. Intro and outro music by Adam Hopper. Music sprinkled throughout the episode featured works by The Big Trouble and Break of Reality, as well as several original compositions performed by Ivan, including Wildlings and Catching Shadows, with special guest Michael Burritt. Links to all music can be found in the show notes for this episode. Thanks for listening.